The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Mark Meynell is a writer, teacher, and speaker based in Berkshire, England. I met him when he spoke at the Hutchmoot Conference in 2018, and I immediately knew he was my kind of people. He thinks deeply without taking himself or the world too seriously. Mark Meynell, thanks so much for being here today. When we met at Hutchmoot last year, and I just loved having a meal or two with you, and just love the work you're doing. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So your book, Wilderness of Mirrors, talks about the culture of cynicism and how dangerous that is, and what some remedies are. And this podcast, as you may know, it's not so much. It's very much about the writing process.
Right.
And so I'm interested in what does, in a culture characterized by contempt and cynicism, what's the writer's responsibility in that kind of world?
I think that's a really important question, and I think it's actually not that contemporary. And I think it's significant that it's something that vexed George Orwell considerably before the Second World War began. So he famously wrote, I guess, a sort of short paper article called The Politics and the English Language.
Right, yeah. I teach that pretty often when I teach creative writing.
Right. Well, I think it's just of such fundamental importance, both for good writing, but also just for the political implications of what we write. And I think he acknowledged that words have extraordinary power, and he was beginning to see how words were being exploited and abused and distorted, and they were being used for an effect rather than to convey meaning.
Right.
And so I think that was a very sort of significant distinction that he made. And I think that gets to the heart of some of the problems we've got in the contemporary world.
You're saying in this, I guess your point being so much of our language is not especially interested in how it reflects reality.
Correct.
But rather how I can, move the needle one way or another, or push an agenda.
Right. So it's sort of rhetoric over reality.
Yeah.
It's about propaganda rather than truth, discernment, argument, trying to sort of work together to find out what is.
Yeah.
That, in the age of the soundbite and the image particularly, Neil Postman was banging on about this
right.
Kind of thing as well.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing that writ large all over the world now.
There was the part of the problem here is that dehumanizing people that you disagree with, it really works.
It does.
In terms of if your desire is to motivate people to act or to vote for you or to whatever, it's really a pretty. It's disheartening how effective it is to treat people as if they're stereotypes, or as if they're, or for that matter, as if they're the enemy just because they disagree on one point or another.
Well, exactly, and. Again, this is nothing new. The Greek orators were talking about this. This is what was happening in the Roman Senate with Cicero. It was very much about winning battles over people. So it was matters of power rather than winning arguments to find out what is true and real. So that, there's absolutely nothing new about that. I think the problem today is you've just got a convergence of a whole range of different factors, plus technology, making it very easy to rally support, instantly. Right. And suddenly you've got a sort of Twitter shaming stampede. And not going into the ins and outs of the specifics, but, Roger Scruton is a well-known philosopher here in the UK. And he had, somebody had found something that he'd said about something, and he was given a sort of a government job to do, and within 5 hours of it going online, he'd lost the job.
Really?
And it was like, whoa, what happened? You've had your cornflakes, and then by lunchtime you're out.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so knowing that, rhetorically speaking, the kind of dehumanizing language is so effective. As you're a writer who believes that everybody's made in the image of God. I don't even know what the question is here. How do you? Is it a situation where you just sort of give up that rhetorical advantage as a way of? Just for the sake of reality, honesty.
It's interesting. For instance, Paul in the Corinthian letters talks about how, we didn't come with all this sort of wisdom and power and all the things that you expect the traveling orator in the agora, in the marketplace, to be, touting his goods. And the way they made money was just by being impressive with all kinds of verbal fireworks. And Paul's saying, no, we've got none of that. We're just presenting Christ and him crucified. Ironically, of course, his letters, and particularly the Corinthian letters, are full of rhetorical devices, and he's using some quite clever things. But I think what is clear is that he is still wanting to serve truth rather than just to win arguments or look impressive or anything like that. He has rejected that kind of approach. And I suppose he's more interested in winning the person for the truth so that they stick with the truth rather than winning the person for his camp.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think even when he can be hard on people, it feels like he's, I'm thinking about, is it in Galatians that he says, basically, why are you letting yourself be a slave? Why are you allowing yourself? He's reminding people of reality, of some reality that he didn't invent. And I think that's such an important. When I think about the writer's job, I think it's exceedingly important, and I think I'm sure you will agree with this, that we, even the imaginative writer, even the fiction writer, our job is not to spin some alternate truth, but rather to say, to invite the reader into some truth that's not obvious from their everyday world. And one of the truths that seems obvious from the everyday world is that might makes right, and that that you do whatever you need to make a point, win a argument, whatever. And the writer is always saying, no, there's something truer than what you see and what you hear. And here's an invitation into it.
I think that's a great way of putting it. I mean, basically, we're not trying to humiliate. We're not trying to batter. We're not trying to sort of win over or pull the wool over people's eyes. We're trying to persuade, if that's what we're trying to, if that's the purpose of the writing, or we're trying to invite, in a piece of great fiction, we're trying to invite the reader to step into somebody else's shoes and say, look at it from this perspective, which is an act of generosity, both of the author and the reader. Mm-hmm. You'll say, okay, no, I'm going to suspend my disbelief. I'm going to suspend whatever things might preoccupy me at the moment, and I'm going to stand in this person's shoes for however long this story takes.
I'm always talking about the generosity that the author needs to offer to the reader, but I love your point that the reader's offering some generosity to the writer too.
I think that's right, and I guess that comes out of my sort of day job being a preacher, because I've, in those crucial first 90 seconds or whatever it is of a sermon, especially in a culture in Europe and in many parts of the States, of course, which is increasingly secular, and the idea that anybody would listen to a monologue for 30, perhaps 40 minutes tops, what other sort of platform or sphere in society does that happen? Wow. It doesn't. Not even politicians get that. They get 30 seconds on the news. And they might be long speeches, but they're not going to be, unless you're a dictator, in which case you own the TV station. And then they can go on for 4 hours. But you're not going to do that anywhere else. And so in those initial seconds of a sermon, you have got to give people a reason to spend 30 minutes of their brain time. Because otherwise they'll be thinking about, what did I miss out for the lunch? Or, we should invite that guy or whatever. And in a sense, you're doing the same for writing, I think. You're trying to say, well, you're making a case for why people should give their attention.
Okay, you mentioned to me earlier today that you're working on a novel. So
strange.
That is an odd thing to do.
Very odd.
So after
I can't cope with reality. That's basically it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, eight nonfiction books, 8 persuasive books. Theoretically persuasive. I guess we could ask around who's been persuaded. And now fiction. What's? Tell me about that. How's that switch going for you?
I've always been a literature guy, humanities background. I can't do science. I can't do mathematics. I leave that to other people. Most of the time, I just have no time for that or ability. So I've always read and wanted to read literature from different cultures. So I work in many different countries in my job, and whenever I go to a new country, I always try to read some fiction by an author from that country, because you just gain something from that. So it's always been a passion. But I think since before I became a Christian at 18, I've always wanted to do it. And so there's only to write a novel, that is, and there's only one way to find out whether you can, and that's you just have to try. So I'm about a third of the way through, and I think I've been amazed by how different it is from writing other stuff. I guess, many people would testify to this, but it's a very different process. And actually, I find it much more scary.
Why? Can you put a finger on what's more scary about it?
I think when you're, you're pitching a non-fiction book to either an agent or an editor or a publisher, you have a thread, you have an argument. You might not know the little details along the way, but you know where you're going, because otherwise you wouldn't be setting out on that journey.
Right.
I think with fiction, you've got a scenario, perhaps you've got a situation, or you've got maybe a moral puzzle to tease out, or whatever it is, and yet actually, if you're trying to be real and true to the characters you created and so on, you actually, well, I don't know. I personally don't feel I know exactly where I'm going with this. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things that I can relate to a kind of writer's block scenario is you're very conscious that every creative decision is like a fork in the road. And so you make a choice out of however many options, and then you're conscious that with unwittingly 3 or 4 or 5 junctions down the road, you've actually precluded something you want to do because of a decision you made. Yeah. And I'm not a chess player at all, so I cannot think 3 moves ahead.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I can be just sitting there thinking, but if I do this, what's going to happen there, and so on. So it's just like this infinite range of possibilities.
Yeah.
And I think what I've realized is that road leads to madness if you're trying to plot it all out. I just want to get to know the characters in the story and be a bit more reckless about it, just see where it goes.
Yeah.
But that was quite a sort of a bump to get over, I found.
You say getting to know the characters. That I was, when you were talking about all these decision trees that have, this juncture I could go 5 ways. I'm glad to hear you go straight to knowing the characters, because I feel like that's the only way you can possibly know what to do at those decision trees. I
think because I'm coming at this pretty cold. I've not really done this kind of thing before, and I think teachers at school would have been surprised, because I don't think I did creative writing much at school at all. Mm-hmm. But I guess it's just been sort of percolating over the decades.
Yeah.
But I think because of that, I've read all the sort of the books that people tell you to read, Stephen King on writing, or all those ones. Yeah. And I think that became very clear to me quickly. And I thought about the books that I'd loved and those that really annoyed me. And I think one of the sort of consistent things was you knew where you were with these people immediately, even if you didn't know everything about them.
Right.
But that's what gave you confidence to keep reading, that it wasn't just a formula or an agenda.
Mm-hmm. Have you reached a point in your story, you said you're a third of the way through, where the characters have started to surprise you?
A little bit, yeah. So I've got just a little handful of friends who are reading bits, and there was an argument that a couple of the characters were having. So someone who's a sort of grandmother's age and somebody who's early 20s, and the girl in her 20s was quite rude to the older one. And that, one or two people sort of hit on that and thought, hang on, what's going on here? And yet, when I hadn't planned that, but when I wrote it, I thought, no, this needs to happen, because actually there's something else going on here. And it was just quite interesting that just sort of evolved.
Yeah. Yeah. You, the trick there, I think, in those moments is when a character does something surprising, the question is, does this feel like this has opened up a new door in that person's personality, or does this just feel like another character just stepped in? And
right.
There's different kinds of surprising actions, right? People surprise me all the time, and when they surprise me, I think, okay, there's something I didn't understand about that person before that now I do. And in a book, though, because the author can do whatever he wants to do, sometimes that character ends up doing something that just doesn't feel like it's revealed anything about the character, just feels completely out of character.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the artifice. Everything you write has to have some kind of significance. It's the sort of gun on the wall thing, isn't it?
Yeah, right.
You can't just sort of throw in details and then just let them float around. And because actually, I mean, even in life, when somebody does something out of character, they may not even know why they're doing it. And maybe, 30 years of therapy may not find that out.
Yeah.
But in a book, you just can't do that.
Right.
It seems to me.
Yeah. Okay, so you used a distinction earlier between, you said inviting people in on the one hand, and maybe it was persuading and inviting. Was that the distinction you drew earlier?
Or maybe a sort of parallel. But both are, I guess I was trying to define them in contrast to things like propaganda and a kind of lazy or untoward use of rhetoric, rather than actually just seeing what is true, what means something here, how we understand things.
Okay, so you weren't saying nonfiction persuades and fiction invites. That wasn't your point. Yeah. No.
I think both can do both.
Right. Yeah. Do you think of as fiction as being more of an invitation than a persuasion, and nonfiction as more of a persuasion than an invitation?
I'm sure that's right, because, and you'll know this better than I know it, but I think that when fiction sets out deliberately to be persuasive, then it just becomes propaganda. It doesn't really live. It's. I mean, I went to an exhibition at the Royal Academy in the UK, in London, I don't know, about 10 years ago, and it was about Soviet propaganda from before the Second World War. So at the time when, there was still great optimism, and, in the early 30s, actually, intellectuals all over the world thought this was really the way ahead, and it's just a matter of time before all of us join that bandwagon. But going around this exhibition, looking at sort of posters, looking at the realist art that they were commissioning, and excluding all the sort of figurative or the metaphorical or the abstract, it was just like being hit over the head with a sledgehammer. It was just like, this is what it is. There's no equivocation. There's no doubt. There's no invitation to think about this for a minute. And I guess sometimes you can find a lot of writing trying and doing that, and dare I say, some Christian fiction. But I haven't read enough of that to have a very strong opinion, mainly because I don't want to read it. No, but that's really unfair. So one of my heroes, for instance, is Greene, a Roman Catholic, and someone who became a Catholic from a classic English private school Anglican background. He wrestled with his own fallenness, and he was a rogue, and he would wrestle with that all his life. And yet I have found some of his novels so spiritually enriching because he's been real. I think now this is what it's about. So you could say it's fiction written by a professing Christian, rather than just sort of Christian fiction that has an agenda to bully. Or
Christian fiction as a marketing category, which is I think that's a big problem with what we call Christian fiction, is that it's a marketing category, not a theological or artistic category.
And basically, there's hardly any in the UK, as you might imagine. We just don't have it.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can get some people to bring you over a package or something.
I think that'd be lovely. Yes, thank you very much. Well, I'm coming to Hutchmoot in October, so maybe I could pick up some. There you go.
That's what you can do. Okay, so as we were talking about persuading and inviting, I got to thinking about a phrase that Flannery O'Connor used. We've only been talking for 29 minutes, and Flannery O'Connor is just now
I'm
coming
really impressed.
Up. Yeah, thank you.
That's quite disciplined, isn't it?
That's unusual for me. But she talked about persuading through the senses.
Right.
I can't remember if this is in the same passage or not, because she kind of tended to rehash in her essays, says the same things over and over again. But she talks about the idea that the eye is an organ of judgment, and we know this. We're very familiar with the idea that inputs come in through our eyeballs or through our ears or whatever, and then the figuring out part of our brain or the judging part of our brain goes to work. And she says inexperienced fiction writers think that the sensing mechanism and the judging mechanisms are two completely different things, but the experienced writer knows that those two things happen simultaneously all the time. By the way, I said simultaneously because you're British instead of simultaneously. So that was for you.
I appreciate that cultural sensitivity.
Yeah, and I think that's when you've been writing 8 nonfiction books of a persuasive nature, you're working so hard to organize your ideas so that the cerebral part of the brain can make sense of those things. And then now you're jumping the barrier over to fiction. And if you seek to organize this around cerebral categories, you're not going to write a very good book. And even if I didn't, I may not write a very good book. I guess that's possible.
But yes,
too.
You're right.
I have confidence in you, Mark.
Well, that's marvelous. Thank you. I'll keep going then.
But it's all about presenting. It's presenting experience in as close as possible a way as you can to the way that we receive experience in real life.
Right.
And that's very different from organizing, from things having a logical or rational relationship with one another. And that's what nonfiction is all about. And that's not what fiction is about.
That's right. And I think, you could maybe sort of bring all of that under an umbrella of clarity. You really, and this is what Orwell is wanting to do, particularly because of the whole sort of untoward use of oratory by politicians who are deliberately fogging things up so that people follow them without knowing what they're wanting to do, if anything. But, in terms of being a preacher, but also in terms of writing nonfiction, you are wanting clarity so that people know exactly as much as is possible for a reader, but to know exactly where you're going with this and why. Because if you're wanting to persuade, they need to follow along. It's not just the sort of devices. I think one of the things that's struck me is exactly this in fiction, and I want to, as much as possible, one of the words in the back of my mind to try and avoid is exposition in the narrative. So it's the Star Wars dialogue problem that's absolutely impossible for actors to say because it's just ludicrous. It's just so full of explanations of how the warp system works or whatever it's called. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but then of course that's not real, is it? So I better be careful. But the thing is, what I'm trying to write about is it's actually set in the Cold War, but it's not about spies, but it's set in East Germany in the 60s. But I'm trying to use music and nature as a way of trying to give people a sense of humanity in this system, in the architecture that is just brutalist and everything's rectangular, all of this. And so I'm trying to, it's probably highly overambitious, but I'm trying to convey the emotional liberation that, say, going to a concert of Shostakovich music brings to somebody. So, that's completely the antithesis of an argument.
Right. Yeah. And, when I read a story, somebody sends me a story, for critique or whatever, the first question I always am looking for is where are those places where I understand what the author is doing better than I understand what the characters are doing. Right. I know why the writer wanted that character to do that, but I can't imagine the character doing that in real life. And that's that's something that's a great one. That's a challenge. Again, when you're moved in nonfiction, in persuasive writing, it's really important that the reader understand what the author is up to.
Yeah.
And in fiction, it's kind of important that it not feel like they know what the author is up to.
I think that's really helpful. So I'm not going to be sending you my manuscripts anytime soon.
Okay, good.
Just to give you a break. But maybe we need to just unpack persuasion a little bit, because in a way, in fiction, you're persuading the reader of the reality of this person.
Yeah.
In nonfiction, you're persuading of the logic of the argument, or the fact that actually you've proved your case. Mm-hmm. Whether it's historical evidence or whatever it is.
Well, yeah.
So plausibility, I suppose, is maybe another way of putting it for fiction.
Yes.
And that's the key thing. Does this person, this character, seem to live?
Yeah. Yeah. And so you will very often give up clarity.
Yeah.
For the sake of a plausible character. And in your persuasive writing, you better not give up clarity.
Right.
Give up
because
anything else.
That's right. You won't be persuasive.
Yeah. And in fiction, there are plenty of cases where clarity ruins the plausibility, So
some of those close to me know that I'm mildly obsessed by U2, and I think Bono is interesting here. And I just wonder whether one of the reasons Bono drives people a bit crazy, because they see him as self-righteous and all of that. And there's probably something in that, I don't know. But the point is, I think the confusion comes because he's mixing two categories in a way. He's a poet, and I think he's a fine poet. And I love the songs as much for their words and provocations as for the music.
Yeah.
But then he'll suddenly start preaching. And you want your preachers to be clear, but you don't want your poets necessarily to be clear.
Yeah.
You want them to evoke or provoke. But then when he suddenly starts pontificating, then you think, hang on, what's going on here? Now, actually, I can cope with the pontification, because I personally think a lot of the time, not always, but he's earned the right to do it. Because there is an integrity behind it. He's not just a celeb guy who's jumping on bandwagons. He does his work. But be that as it may, I think the thing is, I think it is confusing when he's blurred the lines.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was at this is just an amusing anecdote. This is free, actually, Mark. This is
good. So I'm not paying for this.
You're not paying for this one. I went to a concert in a venue, a bar, basically. Okay, it was a bar, and there was
you the only one there? No.
and very crowded. People were having a good time. There was this young performer who was giving his patter between his songs, and everybody was talking because they were at a bar, and that's what people do. They talk to each other at a bar. And he says, "Hey," kind of shouted everybody down and says, "I'm trying to tell a meaningful story about my relationship with my father. And you're not listening." And he wasn't joking. And people just fell silent because they were just agog that this guy thought they should
they finish their drink quickly and leave. I would. See, I came to here to have a chat. Nice time.
But anyway, that made me think about you two mixing those. Yeah, I mean, this young man didn't really understand what he was there for, right? All right, we got to wrap up. Last question. This is the question I like to ask at the end of these conversations. Who is a writer or a couple of writers who make you feel like writing, who make you go sit down and write?
Greene's definitely one of them. Talked about him.
Okay.
And I had a sabbatical a few years ago and tried to read all of him. I didn't quite manage it, but I did most of it. And that was extraordinary. I think a writer I really admire and have had the privilege of meeting is John LeCarre, who has, I think, well, I know I'm not the only one, but has turned espionage, Cold War fiction into literature, and it really is great quality stuff.
I haven't read it, but I just hear it's just great stuff.
He's just got a wonderful ear he in half a sentence he can evoke a Middle European guy who's a bit shifty.
Really?
He just can hear it and manage to sort of notate it like music.
Yeah. He's a Brit, isn't he?
He is. I'm afraid he is. Yes. Yeah. We have some writers over here, and
I've heard of some. Yeah.
Yeah. But one I've discovered recently, and it's only because I was doing a course and this was on the set list, and I guess just because I judge books by covers, as everybody does, I would never have picked this up. But Elizabeth Strout,
I don't know her.
She is from, I think she's from New England. Huh. She has won a Pulitzer and one or two others. And there's a book called Olive Kittredge, which is...
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that book.
Yeah, so a bunch of short stories, all set in the same town.
Okay.
And in a sort of fishing town.
Okay.
And there's this character, Olive, is a sort of thread through all of them to lesser or greater degrees. But I have to say, within 5 minutes, I was just... staring at the page, just thinking that is just an amazing paragraph.
Yeah,
and it was just beautiful.
Okay, I'm going to check that out.
And I was blown away. So it's nice making those kind of discoveries, really. And you just think, okay, now that if I could write a paragraph like that, I could die happy.
Yeah. All right, Mark. Thank you. Thanks for negotiating the time difference. You did a great job on that, by the way.
Oh, well, I can do mathematics when I need to.
All right, thanks. And I hope to see you in October.
That'd be great. Thanks so much, Jonathan.
See you, Mark.
Cheers.
All right, thank you. And that was fun, except for your dog.
Could you hear the dog?
Yeah, a little bit. No big.
Oh, well, you could introduce... she's called Pickle. You could introduce her.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio and the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to the Arcadian Wild for allowing us to use their delightful song Finch in the Pantry as part of this podcast. Check out their album of the same name for more excellent music.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to fostering Christ-centered community and spiritual formation through music, story, and art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.